Lieutenant General Richard Newton joining me live here in studio tonight. So banning Russian flights over U.S. airspace, this is a major move.
It is a major move, and we're raising our stakes in terms of, if recall, obviously the sanctions, but this is also an operational maneuver that is in concert with the sanctions as well. And I think it is significant. I don't recall in my near history in terms of recollection of actually banning Russian flights over the United States. And we're raising our stakes in terms of, so it's extraordinary, obviously the sanctions, but this is also not so much the airline industry, but passenger travel with the sanctions as well. And I think it is significant, airspace, but also the travel.
Citizens and others. This is a major, have some serious ripple effects. I want to talk about some of the damage that we're seeing, in particular this massive explosion of this government building in Kharkiv earlier today. We also saw a TV tower blow up in front of our eyes in Kyiv. What does this tell you about the Russian forces' tactics and targets right now at this point in the game?
Well, to put Kharkiv in perspective, population 1.5 million, about the size of San Diego. And the fact that the Russians are, again, intensifying their attacks, not only in government
military targets, but also civilian targets. My sources tell me, and we've heard in the media, that actually is going into, not so much the airline industry per se, but passenger travel also. It's not just the aircraft not being able to fly into U.S. Airspace, but also the travel of Russian citizens and others back and forth to Russia.
Could have some serious ripple effects. I want to talk about some of the damage that we're seeing, in particular this massive explosion of this government building in Kharkiv earlier today. We also saw a TV tower blow up in front of our eyes in Kyiv. What does this tell you about the Russian forces' tactics and targets right now at this point in the game?
Well, to put Kharkiv in perspective, population 1.5 million, about the size of San Diego. And the fact that the Russians are, again, intensifying their attacks, not only in government and military targets, but also civilian targets. My sources tell me, and we've heard in the media, that actually is going and attacking civilian neighborhoods, which is extraordinary because he's now almost indiscriminate in terms of his use of firepower against military targets and government targets, but now civilians as well.
And we have seen that 40-mile convoy stymied of Russian troops in terms of the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian civilians being able to hold them back. The question is, how long can they do that? I want to talk to you about tonight's State of the Union and the message from President Biden, not just to the American people, but critically important to our U.S. troops and also service families here at home. What do they want to hear from the president tonight, given this ongoing crisis in Ukraine?
Well, the President of the United States is the head of state, but he's also the commander-in-chief of our U.S. military. We have 2.2 million men and women in uniform. That consists of active duty, guard, and reserve. And if you call recently, he called up on several thousands, 12, 13, 14,000 men and women from Fort Bragg and Fort Stewart and elsewhere. And so that is, he personally calls them up. And so he needs to make sure that he messages our men and women in uniform that their sacrifices are worthy, their sacrifices have purpose, in this case, to deter and dissuade continued aggression by the Russian forces in Ukraine, but also to bolster the alliance, to bolster the NATO alliance through the use of U.S. military. Also, the message is just as important to the family members. Those loved ones stay by the side of our military through generations, and it's just as important, if not even more important right now, for the moment, if you will, of our family members who are supporting the loved ones to, again, go to harm's way.
Lives are at stake. It's important tonight, and an important message. Lieutenant General Richard Newton, as always, thank you. We'll be seeing you throughout the night. Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.
All right. Okay, guys. Okay, let's go back online. Okay. So, yan yung mga kaganapan ngayon. Binad na ni Biden yung airspace nila para sa mga Russian plane. So, ito muna tayo sa sa balita dito sa Ukraine. So, I will share you some of the news about this war in Ukraine. So, bakit ba may gera sa Ukraine? Diba? So, isang simple lang sagot yan eh. Okay, dahil si Putin ay isang diktador. Yun po ang dahilan doon. Si Putin ay nangangarap ibalik yung dating USSR or Union Soviet Socialist Republic na dating sakop nila ang Ukraine. At marami dyan, Estonia, Belarus, yan mga sakop niya dati. Even I think Poland, sakop rin niya nung mga panahon na yun. So gusto niyang ibalik yun ang pangarap ni Putin. Kaya niya ginagawa yung mga bagay na yan. So ang Amerika naman, and even NATO, hindi sila makakilos kasi bakit? Hindi kasi miyembro ng NATO at ang Ukraine. Bakit hindi naging miyembro, di ba? Though yung Ukraine gusto nilang maging miyembro kasi pinipigilan siya ng Russia that time. Kaya ang gusto ng Russia maging hindi sila miyembro ng neutral lang ba, hindi maging miyembro ng NATO. So even yung Estonia, ganun din ang ginagawa, o Romania. So I think Romania is a member of ng NATO na. Kaya hindi magalaw-galaw ni Putin. Anyway, I will show you some videos na nakuha ko. Mga natadaanan kong videos about this related news. Tapos ikakabit natin to sa atin mismo. Okay? Sa ating bansa, okay? Sa ating political system. Itong nangyayari sa Ukraine, di ba? Okay, kasi ang umiiral ngayon sa atin is ang unang panahon, di ba? Si Marcos is diktador, di ba? Ganyan din si Putin, diktador. Okay, itong si Digong, di ba? Oo, mga tyrant yan Leader, tawag yan Okay? So si mga diktador katulad ni Jinping, di ba? So yun ang gusto nilang mangyari. Ngayon sa eleksyon na to, tataka ako sa mga kababayan natin kung bakit sila boboto ng isang diktador ulit, di ba? Hindi ba nila alam? Sa panahon ngayon, sa modern world ngayon, ang pagiging diktador pinandidirihan na. Yun ang katotohanan dyan. So dapat maging tayo, maging mapanuri tayo, So siguro nung araw, tulad nung panahon nila Hitler, okay, naging very successful si Hitler kasi iyon ang kanyang kumbaga brand of leadership. So kaya nga siya kinamumuhian ngayon Patay na nga, kinamumuhian pa Patay na nga, minumura pa Di ba? So ganyan leader ba ang gusto natin mangyari sa Pilipinas? Di po ba? Di po ba ang Pilipino ay peace-loving country o peace-loving people? So dapat hindi tayo tutulad dyan kila Putin o sa Russia. Okay, sa totoo lang, may anak rin ako sa Russia, so I'm so worried. Worried na ako doon, siyempre. Diba, kung ano mangyari sa Russia, piktado rin yung anak ko ron. Anyway, wag naman sana, pero sa Pilipinas, okay, alam niyo ba na ang mga namumuno na diktador ikinamumuhian po yan sa buong mundo ngayon. Lalo na sa modern world. Kasi hindi na maisikreto yung mga ginagawa nilang kasamaan. Kasi because of the information technology na po, mabilis na po eh. Unang-una, madali ka magsinungaling. Oo, katulad ng ginagawa nila LBM. Di ba? Nagsisinungaling sila in public. Even they enabling enabling niya yung mga fake news, di ba? Pero madali rin ma-fact check 'yon, okay? So walang forever doon. So madaling sa ngayon kasi mabilis eh. Hindi na kailangan ng kung ano pa eh. Dati kasi naniniwala tayo sa mga kasabihan nga lang mga araw, naniniwala na tayo, di ba? Mga engkanto, mga gano'n, di ba? Yung kwento ng mga lolo, naniniwala tayo. Because huwag natin ma-fact check kasi wala namang internet noon at di naman nakasulat sa libro yun. So, sa modern world, hindi na effective eh. Sa ngayon. So dapat nating pag-isipan, lalo sa ngayon, darating na eleksyon. Oo. Sa totoo lang, gusto ko lang i-discuss to. No? Alam niyo ba, sa history natin, matagal po tayo pinagkaitan ang mga kababayan natin noong mga panahon na bumoto o magpahayag ng sarili nilang opinion o even pagboto. Okay? Matagal na panahon kasi siyempre under po tayo ng colony ng Spaniards at ng kung anong mga nasyon pa. Even Japan. Actually, dito ako sa Japan. So napagkaitan po tayong pumili ng ating leader noong unang panahon. So ngayon po na binigyan tayo ng pagkakataon pumili ng ating leader, huwag po nating sayangin yon at huwag po nating ibenta yung boto natin. Di po ba? Anyway, papakita lang po ako ng konting kagabi kasi nag-search ako. Dami akong nakita. Actually, nakakalungkot yung mga pangyayari. Pero, anong magagawa ng isang katulad nating pangkaraniwang tao? Di ba? Tapos naanin niyo ba yung interview kay LBM? Kung ano ang magiging stand niya. Di ba? So, wala eh. Anyway, wait lang po. Wait lang. At ako'y mag-share po ng isang kanta sa inyo. Ito ay okay, bago yung kanta, share ko muna siguro yung isang istorya ng panahon ng mga Marcos. Okay, para maintindihan nyo kung ano yung diktador ng araw sa Pilipinas. So, share ko po yung kanyang istorya.
Si Enrique, si Francisco Jr.
Okay.
Ang mga victims kasi sa
okay, so share ko muna Okay. Then pupunta tayo sa ibang mga istorya. So ngayon ang ating tema, halo-halo muna. Okay, so may Ukraine. Kasi tingin ko yung nangyayari sa Ukraine is connected sa Pilipinas, even sa eleksyon natin. Connected kasi bakit? May mga kandidato kasing diktator eh. So huwag natin tularan yun.
Pamilya, si Mamang, si Papang, yung panganay namin, si Enrique, si Francisco Jr., and then si Ate Laila, tapos si Manong Romulo, tapos si Armando, and then ako, and then bunso namin.
Ito.
Yan, ako yan. Sige.
Ikaw na ito? Ikaw yan?
Oo. Ano to? First year high school ako. Pinaupo ako sa ice block, tapos nilublob pa ako sa kasilyas. Nalis lahat ng damit ko. Tapos sinukuryente ako. Tapos mawawalan ako ng malay, tapos mamaya na naman, uulitin na naman. Pag naalala ko yun talagang talagang... This used to be the La Union Constabulary Command. Dinala ako dito sa building na yan, merong officer's quarter, doon ako na-torture. Rinade na rin yung bahay namin sa San Fernando. Kinuha si Mamang, si Papang, si Kuya ko Francisco. Yun, 3 sila. Kasi they were looking for Romulo and Armando. Actually, as early as December 1974, we already heard na namatay na sila, yung 2 kapatid ko, si Romulo and Armando. My sister, sila yung nag-retrieve yung body niya sa Hungduan na Fugao. Sa bugtong unang ulo niya, ang balita namin, sa rifle butt. Noong araw ng libing, merong nag-abot sa ate ko na sulat galing kay Armando. Tapos yung nagbigay sinabi na rin na namatay na rin siya together with other 4 unknown na kasama niya. So parang double whammy sa amin para sa akin yung nililibing mo yung isang kapatid mo tapos here comes another news na yung isa rin wala na rin. So kung hindi ka magpro-protesta, you keep silent, you just accept tyranny, you just accept powerlessness, you just accept plundering. Despite yung nangyari sa pamilya at sa mga kakilala ko, mga kaibigan ko na naging biktima, given the chance, I would do it all over again.
So yan po, So, ang istorya ng isang kababayan natin. Anyway, mag-share po ako ng ibang videos,
我们坚决反对美方捏造不实信息，
lang po.
抹黑中国形象。我注意到近期
Nagkasalita
美国
ng Czech,
国际问题专家托马斯
Anyway, so share pa ho tayo ng ibang experience sa martial law. Even si Comneri po na naka-experience po siya ng martial law. Okay, so share po natin si Comneri. Ito. Okay, Marcos Ira. Tignan natin.
LINE 公式アカウント。
ただのチラシじゃ見てもらえないのよ。全然。
ここ使わない。
LINE 公式アカウント使おう。
LINE 公式アカウント使おうと。
May commercial po.
お店からの情報一発配信。邪魔すもんね、めっちゃ。
邪魔っていうか
LINE 公式アカウント。
Okay. Comneri to
このゲーム始めたけど装備も何もないじゃないか。落ちてる瓶蹴っ飛ば
Good evening, I'm Christian Esguerra, and welcome to this episode of After the Fact, where we get to see things more clearly. We get a better sense of the truth. Let's begin by dissecting the news. Today we're celebrating a
pivotal moment in our country's history when Filipinos, quite literally, setting down the barrel of a gun, drove away a dictator and his family. The EDSA People Power Revolution in 1986 would go on to inspire similar pro-democracy uprisings elsewhere in the world. But 36 years later, the Marcoses are back in power. Not that they actually left anyway, But the son and namesake of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos, enjoying significant leads in pre-election surveys, is in position to reclaim Malacanang. Now, one of the prevailing narratives being peddled today by its loyalists, the so-called golden years. Tonight, we'll debunk this lousy myth. We'll speak with two key officials, a former central bank governor and a former finance secretary who helped fix the economic mess left behind by Marcos and his cronies. Now, be part of our discussion. Send us your questions and comments on our YouTube live chat or tweet us using the hashtag #ANCAfterTheFact. Joining us tonight is former Philippine Central Bank Governor Jose Cuisia Jr. and former Philippine Finance Secretary Jesus Estanislao. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us tonight on the program.
Good evening, Christian, and thank you for inviting us.
Okay, people are celebrating the 36th anniversary of the EDSA People Power 1. That pivotal moment when Marcos was driven away. I'd like to start with a question regarding the kind of life under Marcos, the kind of economic conditions that we had, especially during the closing days or years of the Marcos regime, and the kind of mess that he left behind. I'd like to start with Mr. Estanislao.
Well, not just the closing years, but many years before the closing years. We were under a regime of controls, very tight regulation, and the people who were running the government made sure that the rules and the regulations were in the favor of friends, cronies, family, and relatives. It was not Filipino first. It was family first, friends first, and cronies first. So it was a government where everything was stacked up against everybody who did not belong to friends, family, and cronies. So competition was not allowed.
And how did that exactly?
Yes.
So there was no semblance of competition because the cronies were basically or practically favored. But how did that kind of policy, that kind of scenario affect the ordinary Filipino at that time?
It simply means that if you wanted to get dollars in order to travel abroad, you cannot easily get dollars because the dollars were reserved for the privileged. If you are an ordinary businessman and you wanted to get some credit from DBP or any one of the financial institutions, credit was reserved for the privileged. So they had all of the benefits stacked in their favor and against everybody else. And the best example of that would be for the ordinary person. You could not easily buy apples, grapes, oranges outside of Christmas because that was not allowed in. That was part of the rule. And why? Because dollars were rationed, and in the rationing of dollars, who do you think would get first crack at getting dollars?
And how bad were the foreign exchange reserves of the Philippines at that time?
They were very bad, and maybe Governor Cuisia can tell you exactly where we were.
Okay.
When Governor Fernandez took over in 1984 from Governor Laya, he found out that the international reserves of the Philippines had actually gone to zero, actually below zero, because we ended up with a minus 400 million in terms of reserves. So that meant that we owed the foreign banks 400 million. And this is why they were very upset with the Philippines, because you will recall that the IMF discovered that the central bank was finagling with the figures, and they were overstating, they were window dressing the actual position of the central bank. So when he had a special audit done, Governor Fernandez found out that it was not just zero international reserves, minus $400 million, which we owe the banks.
How did Marcos get away with this? The fact that the foreign exchange reserves are overstated, I think in the vicinity of $600 million. How did this happen?
Well, this is why we could not borrow from the international market. For 10 years, we were absent from the international financial markets. The multilaterals stopped lending to the Philippines, the IMF, the World Bank, the ADB. This is why we were in such a deep trouble, deep hole at that time. And it was really very excruciating for the officials like Governor Fernandez, to be able to convince the banks that we were still a credit-worthy country. They did not believe us. So our credibility was really shot.
Okay. I'd like to go to Secretary Stanislao. Let's talk about the companies that were farmed out or given away to the cronies and the loans that they took, and what happened to those loans afterward.
Well, my first assignment in government was with DBP. It was a bankrupt bank. When I took over, more than 93% of the assets recorded in the books of DBP were non-performing assets. So while we had NPAs running around, the communist insurgents, the countryside, we had the worst kind of NPA in our banking system. In the case of DBP, I can tell you, I was faced with a set of books whose assets were non-performing. More than 93% of the books, of the assets listed in our books were non-performing. So eventually we had to foreclose those assets. And who are these? They were the cronies and the relatives of the people who are in power at that time.
How about the loans that were guaranteed by the Philippine government? What happened to them afterward?
The National Treasury had to assume them because in effect they were guaranteed by the National Treasury and therefore guaranteed by the Philippine Republic, and therefore they became public debts.
And of course, the Philippine government had to come in to infuse money into both DBP and PNB because they were practically bankrupt, as Jess was saying. No.
Okay. Now, in the case of DBP, Christian, you might want to know.
Go ahead.
The Philippine government at that time had to infuse 10 billion pesos of 1986 money into DBP so that it would continue to operate. And by the way, the same amount was infused into PNB. So between these two institutions alone, which were bankrupt, out of the people's money, we had to put in 10 billion pesos of fresh capital separately into PNB and DBP.
Okay, let's talk about the bigger picture of the foreign debt and how long did it take for us to actually pay off those foreign debts incurred during the Marcos years?
Well, when we came in, Christian, we had to restructure. Actually, the restructuring was initiated by Governor Jogo Fernandez. But as you know, he was ill. So when I took over in February 1990, we continued the negotiations and we had two tranches. $11 billion for one tranche and around $6.7 billion.
Abangan nyo po, pag-usapan po natin itong pinag-uusapan nila, itong panahon po ng Marcos na tinatawag nilang the golden age. So pag-usapan po natin yan. So para malaman po natin, mamaya po yan, ano? Para malaman natin kung ano po talaga. Okay, so sign up.
But finally, we were able to convince them.
I'll see you later.
And they
Thank you.